Hello everyone, and welcome to the Amazon Web Services Elastic MapReduce Setup lecture. If you ever want to quickly set up a cluster with a notebook interface, Amazon Web Services Elastic MapReduce service is actually a really good choice. But please note, what we're going to be showing in this lecture does not fall under the free trial of AWS. You will be charged, and depending on what kind of instance you do, how large your cluster is, the price varies. So definitely check out Amazon's own official documentation for pricing to get the latest pricing and how much this would actually cost you. In this particular lecture, we're going to walk through setting up the Zeppelin notebook on AWS EMR. And we're also going to discuss some security options. And I highly recommend you watch the EC2 instance lectures first before watching this particular lecture to learn more about SSH in case this is something you see yourself doing in the future. Now, the Zeppelin notebook is a fairly new environment that mimics a lot of the Jupyter Notebook's capabilities, but was created specifically with big data in mind, things like Spark and Hadoop. What we're going to do is quickly explore what the Zeppelin notebook looks like on their official documentation page, and then go through the process of setting up our own on AWS EMR. And creating the cluster on AWS EMR can take a while to initialize, so while it's initializing the master node and the slave nodes, we're going to show you how to set up the security. So take some time with this. The actual cluster creation, the process is really fast, but AWS on their end setting up the server, sometimes it takes a little while. And then we're also going to talk about security settings as we set up the Zeppelin notebook running on EMR. I really want to stress here that make sure to read through the resource documentation to choose the best security settings for you or your organization. The way we're doing it here may not be secure enough for your needs. Okay, let's get started and jump into the documentation. I'm going to go over to zeppelin.apache.org, and afterwards we're going to log into our AWS console at aws.amazon.com and show you how you can go to the EMR. Okay, here I am at zeppelin.apache.org. This is the official documentation page, and this is basically almost like a Jupyter Notebook, except like I said, it's really designed to support a lot of different big data backends. So things like SQL, Scala, Spark, Hadoop, those kind of things, Hive, etc. And the current version is 0.7 at this point in time, and they've added a couple new things like multi-user support, a lot of improvements in Python, which is good for us, and then they integrated matplotlib into some of that Python stuff. Plus, they now support Spark 2.1, which at this point in filming is the latest version of Spark. Now, if you just want a general idea of what is Apache Zeppelin, it's a multi-purpose notebook for data discovery, data analytics, and also has some visualization capabilities built into it. And more importantly, it supports lots of language backends. So you can see here it supports things like Cassandra, R, Hive, Flink, Elasticsearch, Python, HDFS, etc. So lots and lots of stuff that Zeppelin can support, a lot more than just the Jupyter Notebook itself. And really what's its main key point is that especially Apache Zeppelin provides built-in Spark integration. So it's really designed with Spark in mind, and everything else is kind of built on top of that. Plus it has data visualizations and dynamic forms and really strong support for Spark SQL. So you can always just check out the documentation here by clicking on this, and then if you go to 0.7.1, it'll talk a lot more about some of the quick start capabilities, so configuring it, tutorials, dynamic forms, etc. And I encourage you to explore this documentation if you think Zeppelin Notebook is something you're going to be using in the future. But what I'm going to do now is basically walk through the process of setting everything up. So let's jump over to our AWS console. Alright, once you log in to aws.amazon.com, you should be able to search for AWS services, or you can always just click here and look at the various services. But what we're going to be using is EMR. So if you either search for EMR or Elastic MapReduce, it should be some managed Hadoop framework. So click on that, and then you have these options of creating clusters. So you can see here, I already had a cluster that's been terminated. So click here on Create Cluster. This is your first time, you probably don't have one yet. And then you'll be taken to this page. And what you want to do is give the cluster a name. So we can say like new cluster or whatever you want. You can link it up to an S3 folder if you want to do that. And more importantly, down here on the software configuration, what we're going to be choosing is all the way here at the bottom where it says Spark and Zeppelin. And that's what you want to make sure is included. So maybe these applications will show in a different order for you, but definitely make sure that it shows Spark, and I can zoom in here to make it a little clearer, and the Zeppelin notebook. That's the one we need. And then as far as hardware configuration, this is where, based off your needs, if you want more power, or more storage or faster computing, you can choose different types of instances, and you basically choose one master and then however many core nodes you want. And you can set the instance type and the number of instances here. I'm going to stick to the default, so large, but if you want to make it a little cheaper, you can come over here and go to like medium of the previous generation. It's really up to you. We can even just stick to medium. Then finally, you have the security and access options. The most basic option is just to proceed without an EC2 key pair. That's kind of a lower security option. That means if someone doesn't have that key pair, they can still access your instance as long as they know the actual address to locate it at. If you're thinking of just going through this one time and you just kind of want to get the feel of creating the cluster and you're immediately going to shut it down, then go ahead and proceed without an EC2 key pair. It's really easy, you don't really need it. But let me briefly explain, in case you didn't watch the EC2 lectures, how you can create an EC2 key pair. All you have to do is click over here on Learn how to create an EC2 key pair. And you just come over here, follow these instructions to actually create an EC2 key pair. It's pretty straightforward. Just come here to the Amazon EC2 console, go to click key pairs, create a key pair, click create, and save the resulting PM file in a safe location. And then you're going to need to modify your PEM file if you are on a Windows or a Mac. So there's instructions here on how to do this on Windows, and if you click here on this tab, there's instructions on how to do it on a Mac. Since you may or may not have done this before, I'm going to briefly create a new key pair. That way you can actually see how this works. So I'm going to open my Amazon EC2 console in a new window and click on key pairs in the navigation pane. So if I come here to my console, I'm going to see key pairs here. I've already created some, but let's just make another one. I'm going to click here on create key pair and type in your create key pair name. So for instance, we'll call this my Spark key. Click on create. Once you've created that new key pair, it should automatically have downloaded that PEM file. It's really important that you remember where this PEM file is. You basically don't get another chance to download another one. So make sure you know the location of this PEM file that you just created and downloaded. All right, so once you have that PEM file, make sure you save it to a location that you remember. Coming back here to our AWS Setup key pair, once you have that PEM or PEM file in a safe location, you're probably going to need to modify your PEM file in order to SSH or securely connect to your cluster. Now, modifying this PEM file is a little different depending on whether you're on a Mac or Linux or a Windows computer. Amazon Web Services actually has really nice instructions for either a version, but basically if you're on a Mac or Linux, you're just going to open up your terminal and type this command. You're going to say chmod space og-rwx and then mykeypair.pem or whatever you called your key pair. Now, remember you have to be at the same directory location where you saved your .pem file. Now, if you're on Windows, it's going to be a little more involved. You have to download puttygen.ex to your computer. There's a link right here to download it. You're going to launch the puttygen, click load, select the PM file you created earlier, click open, then click OK on the puttygen notice telling you your key was successfully imported. Enter a passphrase in the key passphrase field. Click Save Private Key, save it in a PPK format. That's the format Windows needs for SSH into a cluster. And then you're going to name your putty private key, such as mykeypair.ppk, click Save, and then exit the puttygen application. Okay. So go ahead and do that, whether you're on a Windows or Mac. Take care of this PEM file. I'm on a Windows, so I'll be using this puttygen right now. Windows is a little more involved, but again, Amazon Web Services has really good documentation on this. So if you ever get stuck, you can either just look at these steps, it's pretty straightforward, or just Google search AWS SSH, EC2 key pair, or something similar. And Amazon EMR has a whole management guide on how to do this step by step. All right, so I'm going to close this. Again, the instructions are always here for you. Just learn how to create an EC2 key pair. I'm going to choose the one EC2 key pair I just made, which was my Spark key. And then I'm going to come down here and click on Create Cluster. And that's going to be creating your cluster right now. Now, it usually takes a couple minutes to actually fully create the cluster, so you may need to just wait a little while. It's going to say starting for a little bit, but it's actually creating our cluster right now, and it has the My Spark key for security and access. Okay, while you're waiting for your cluster to actually initialize, what you want to do is make sure that you're going to be able to SSH into your Zeppelin notebook. And for that, you may need to change the security settings. So what you're going to do is under Security and Access, come here and click on Security Groups for Master. That will take you to this new link on Security Groups. Alright, once you're on this Security Group page, what you're going to do is select the MapReduce Master, click here, and then you should see the security groups. And if you click on Inbound tab, what you want to do is click here on Edit, and we're going to open up some ports here. So click on Edit, and then click here where it says Add Rule, and you will get a new little rule pop up, and we want to select SSH, and then make sure that the port is 22. And over here on Custom, we can either select Anywhere or My IP. Now, if you select My IP, that means you can only connect to this cluster from your actual IP address location. That's probably the most secure way of going about this. If you want to click Anywhere, that means anyone will be able to connect to this cluster, which could be dangerous. So for the most secure thing, just click on My IP. And then what we want to do is open up one more rule. So say Add Rule, and then have this be a custom TCP rule. And then what I want to do is open up the port 8890. And again, I'm just going to say My IP. So with those two things selected, click Save. All right, so now that we have our security groups ready to go, what we need to do is just wait for the actual cluster to start. So come back here to the AWS cluster, and it probably is still waiting right now. It may take a couple of minutes, but basically we have everything set up. Okay, coming back to the Amazon AWS console for your cluster, once you see the master is running and the core is running, you should see something like waiting here, and that means your cluster is waiting for you to actually do something with it, which is good to know. What we can do here is you have basically two options depending on how strict you want your security settings to be. You could SSH, and that has to do with all the stuff I was talking about earlier, using that .pem, your key, or your PPK if you're on Windows, and setting up the actual SSH connection. But if you did the security settings that I showed you here, you can actually access your Zeppelin notebook directly through this public URL link. Now keep in mind, this is a pretty open way of accessing a cluster, so this may not be the right setting for you or your organization, depending on how important security is for you. But I can just copy and paste this public DNS into my browser, and then write :8890, remember that was the port we left open for Zeppelin, hit enter, and you should see something that looks like this, the Zeppelin notebook page. And you can import notebooks or create new notebooks, and if you click here on this Zeppelin tutorial file or folder, you'll see it has an example notebook, but this is essentially just that big data version of the Jupyter notebook. So let's create a new note, and then we'll give it a new note name, something like My First Notebook. And there's different default interpreters you can use, like Spark, MD, Angular, SH, Python. If we want to use Python with Spark, what has worked best for me in the past is choosing Spark and then saying you want to use the PySpark interpreter in the notebook. So select Spark, create note, and here, let me zoom in so you can see this. You can end up typing Python with Spark code, but the first thing you need to do in the cell is have a %sign and say PySpark, and then everything else in this cell can then be Python code. If you don't do that, it expects Scala because Spark is written in Scala. So let's start with a really simple example. We'll say something like for x in the list 1, 2, 3, colon, if I hit enter and you see that default indentation, that means it's working, which is good. And then we're going to say print x, do shift enter to run this, and we see 1, 2, 3. It's looking good. And you can notice that it continues on with the PySpark in the next cell, kind of expecting you to continue with PySpark. And luckily, the Zeppelin notebook actually creates a SQL context ready for you. So if you just type SC and do shift enter, that is the Spark context object. And that's what you can use to call different things off of it. Now, usually throughout the course, we're going to be using Spark sessions, not Spark context, because Spark session is what the newer Spark data frame, that 2.0 version, runs off of. And instead of typing SC, the default for that is then going to be just Spark. So Spark is already defined as an object. of the current Spark session. When we run things locally, or maybe even on an EC2 instance that you've seen in the past, or maybe you can check out those other lectures, you'll definitely be seeing me define Spark all the time. But here in the Zeppelin notebook, since it knows that you're going to be working with Spark, it's already set up that variable. So don't ever overwrite Spark. That special variable is already set up as a Spark session. And then off of this, you can do things like read.csv. And then usually, if you're dealing with the Zeppelin notebook, you're in a situation where you're dealing with data that's hosted on S3 with Amazon. So in order to grab that data, you would have to do something like this. Let me show you. You would pass in a string. You would say something like s3n : //, and then you'd have to pass in your keys that allow you to connect to your S3 buckets. And that would look something like, whatever your access key is, then : and then your secret key. And then after that, you can specify what bucket you're looking for. So usually you have buckets in those S3 storage instances. And that would be indicated with an @ symbol. And then you would say whatever the name of your bucket is. And after that, you can then start looking for the actual file. So essentially here, you can just look for the directories, or if it's saved directly under that S3 bucket, just say something like myfile.csv. And obviously this won't find anything, so I won't run this, but that's basically what this would look like. If you have a super large data set that's distributed on S3, Spark can read it from that just by saying spark.read.csv. And then you can also do other options that we show later in the course, things like header or infer schema, etc. But the basic idea behind getting up and running with the Zeppelin notebook with Python is that in each cell, you got to make sure you have this PySpark % command. And then if you want to use a Spark context, you use sc. If you want to call a Spark session, you just call Spark. So those are keywords that are already registered for you. Okay, I hope that was useful to you. And remember to terminate this instance whenever you're done with it. Otherwise, you're going to keep getting charged. So again, this is not free. This doesn't fall under the free limits of Amazon Web Services. Okay, I'll see you at the next lecture.